The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the graveyard, where headstones jutted out like broken teeth from the earth. Thomas, dirt-streaked and weary, paused beside an open grave, his shovel resting heavily against his shoulder. A chill wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faintest sound, soft, muffled, like a heart beating against the confines of wood. He leaned closer, straining against the silence, and suddenly the sound morphed into a desperate gasp. His hands trembled as he pried open the lid of a nearby coffin, revealing a girl with wild, dark hair and wide, terrified eyes. "Emily," she croaked, the name curling around him like smoke. The world shifted, time stilled. Thomas, a gravedigger by trade, felt the weight of a lost daughter rise in the air between them, a name that shattered his resolve and ignited a flicker of hope in an otherwise desolate life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange hue over the small, neglected graveyard. Wind whispered through the crooked headstones, dancing with the fallen leaves that skittered across the uneven ground. Thomas, a gravedigger by trade, dug tirelessly, the rhythmic shoveling of earth a part of his daily routine. He seldom paused. Every dug grave was another acceptance of loss in a world relentlessly marred by grief. Today, however, something felt charged in the air, a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His shovel struck something unfamiliar, a dull thud beneath the earth that sent a shiver through him. Curiosity piqued, he dropped to his knees, dirt dusting his trousers, as he began to clear away the soil. With each handful, a sense of dread curdled in his stomach, an ominous premonition that something was terribly wrong. When the final layer of soil was removed, he hesitated, feeling as if fate itself was holding its breath. In front of him, in the coffin, lay a girl, pale, fragile, and eerily still. Heart racing, Thomas fumbled with the latch, his fingers trembling as he opened the coffin. The girl's eyes fluttered open, wide and fearful, as if awakening from a nightmare. Dirt smeared across her cheeks, and her hair clung damply to her forehead. She was alive, but her survival felt like a jarring paradox. Who was she, and how did she come to be here? With a swift intake of breath, Thomas felt the chill of the world rush in, the weight of abandonment pressing heavily upon them both. "Are you all right?" he managed, his voice gruff, yet edged with a softness he didn't know he possessed. Her gaze, large and frightened, locked onto his, and for a fleeting moment, the space between them dissolved. She didn't answer, her eyes darting around as if searching for escape. It occurred to him, in that desperate moment, that his own history of loss and longing intermingled with her silence, a reflection of ghosts he had buried long ago. "What's your name?" he asked, desperately hoping for a connection, some small piece of human empathy in this bleak moment. She turned her head, the movement slow and tentative, as if every action required immense effort. "Emily," she finally whispered, the name barely more than a breath. The syllables hung in the air, heavy with unspoken stories, a name that traveled like a phantom, pulling at the edges of his heart. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, to assure her that she was safe now, the name echoed again in his mind, slashing through his thoughts like a shard of glass. Emily, his daughter's name, lost years ago in a darkness Thomas had never fully escaped. The joy he felt in her existence suddenly twisted into something painful. His world had once been filled with the laughter of a girl named Emily, but that light had dimmed, replaced by shadows of grief that choked the life from his spirit. For a brief moment, he saw his daughter's face in the girl before him, the same wide eyes, the same curls that danced in the wind. But reality crashed in like an unforgiving wave. This Emily was not his daughter. She was a stranger, a child who had been cast aside, her innocence snatched away in an act of cruelty that left scars invisible to the world. The painful connection throbbed within him, a reminder of everything he had lost and could never reclaim. Thomas felt an instinctive urge to protect, to shelter this girl from the pain that had plagued him for years. But as he looked into her eyes, he realized the chasm that separated them, a gulf filled with incomprehensible trauma that words could never bridge. He yearned to comfort her, to unwrap her from this nightmare, yet an invisible barrier kept him at arm's length, a reminder that he was not the hero of her story. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered above her shoulder, uncertain of whether she would flinch from his touch. In that fragile silence, as the sun began to sink behind the horizon, Thomas understood that healing would not come easily. The past had a way of clinging to the edges of the present, shrouded in grief and regret. Desperation and love warred within him, yet all he could feel was an emotional distance that would take more than hope to dissolve. Emily stepped through the threshold of Thomas's modest home, the creak of the door echoing in the silence that enveloped them both. The air felt heavy, as if they were inhaling the remnants of lives intertwined with loss and unspoken fears. Little sunlight pierced the dusty windows, casting muted shadows across the sparsely furnished living room where the faint scent of earth lingered, a reminder of the graves Thomas tended nearby. She stood there, unsure whether to take a step forward or retreat into the night that had borne her into this strange life. Thomas remained by the door, an imposing figure cloaked in the shadows, his once rugged face drawn tight with fatigue and uncertainty. He had rescued her from the coffin, coaxed her back from the abyss, and yet now, confronted with the reality of their shared existence, he felt an alien weight settle atop his chest. He glanced at her, a fleeting, almost inadvertent connection, before he averted his gaze, afraid to behold the reflection of his own lingering doubts mirrored in her wide, haunted eyes. The walls of the house seemed to breathe with every movement, creaking as if the very structure were waking from a long slumber. Emily shifted her weight, the faint rustle of her clothing breaking the quiet. She caught Thomas watching her from the corner of her vision, a man who had peeled her from death's grasp but remained a stranger. She sensed an invisible line stretched taut between them, an uncharted territory defined by both gratitude and an inexplicable tension. "Do you want something to eat?" The words spilled from Thomas as though he had rehearsed them, yet the warmth was lacking. He moved to the small kitchen in the back, filled with mismatched dishes and the remnants of a life that had halted long before he had pulled her from the dark, a life that felt more like a memory than a reality. Emily followed, the floorboards beneath her feet protesting gently, and she settled at the rickety table that stood at the heart of the space. Bread and cheese lay before her, an unremarkable meal born from necessity rather than desire. Yet she took a bite, the food grounding her after the chaos she had endured. As she chewed, Thomas silently observed, his eyes filled with a strange mix of concern and sorrow. They both bore the weight of their unspoken pasts. Emily's veiled memories of a box that had confounded her with its embrace, and Thomas's fading recollections of laughter that once filled his home before shadows draped themselves over his soul. Emily's heart raced as she swallowed, her thoughts drifting back to what had once been. The moment when she first opened her eyes in that wooden vessel flooded her mind, the panic and confusion of waking up to an eternity of darkness. She felt a flicker of fear, wondering if she would return to that place, even for a moment. She turned her gaze to Thomas, searching for a sign of humanity beneath his cautious demeanor, a hint of understanding that might bridge the chasm between them. "I told you my name," she said quietly, her voice a fragile thread weaving through the stillness. The vulnerability in her tone struck something deep within him, and he felt the urge to share the weight of his own solitude. "But I don't even know yours." "Thomas," he replied, his voice barely a whisper but laced with an unexpected tenderness. It felt strange to speak it aloud, as if he were reclaiming a piece of himself that had long been forgotten. He watched her nod, the acknowledgement a small gesture of acceptance in their new reality. The faint lines of worry etched across her brow softened, and for a brief moment they were suspended in a fragile harmony, two lost souls seeking refuge in one another's presence. Then came the name, prying open the fragile bonds they had begun to forge. "Thomas," she said, "I had a friend named Julie." The sudden mention of the name hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was the name of his daughter, the child he had lost, and in that instant, the walls that separated them began to dissolve. The silence stretched between them, and Thomas could feel his heart contorting in response, the aftershock of grief tinged with an inexplicable flicker of connection igniting within him. In the dim light of that small kitchen, amidst the lingering shadows of the past, Emily and Thomas faced each other for the first time, two figures shrouded in shared grief and hope, uncertain. Outside, the world held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would bring clarity, while inside, the fuse had been lit, a fragile flame flickering to life in the darkness. The sun peeked over the horizon, spilling golden light over the small, quiet town. Thomas adjusted his cap, the brim shading his eyes as he stared at the graveyard. It had become a part of his daily life since Emily emerged from the coffin, a surreal twist in both their fates. He sank his shovel into the earth, rhythmically breaking the soil as he caught sight of her through the trees, picking wildflowers, her laughter floating in the air like a sweet melody. Each tiny bloom she gathered seemed to brighten her spirit, yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper simmered beneath the surface. As the days passed, their routines settled into a comforting rhythm. Thomas would dig and tend to the graves while Emily wandered the grounds, her delicate fingers tracing the headstones. Occasionally she'd pause, inspecting the lichen that grew upon them, whispering ancient names like they were spells. Thomas would steal glances, intrigued as she spoke to the stones as if they could hear her. He often found himself captivated by her innocence, yet a vague disquiet gnawed at him. She seemed to have woven herself into the fabric of the graveyard, yet he was aware that the shadows of her past were yet to be uncovered. In the evenings, they would sit on the old stone bench beneath the willow tree, where the moonlight danced upon the leaves. Thomas would share stories of the townspeople and the history buried within the graveyard. Emily would listen with wide eyes, her face illuminated by moonbeams, occasionally responding with a smile or a quiet question. Yet shadows lingered in those moments. Whenever he mentioned his daughter, a flicker of pain would cross her face, and Thomas hesitated, unsure if he would tread into depths too perilous for both of them. One evening, dried leaves crackled underfoot as Thomas shifted nervously. "You remind me of her," he began, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "My daughter, Lucy. She loved flowers too." He regarded her carefully for a moment, searching for understanding in her expression. Emily's gaze faltered, and the wildflower necklace she wore seemed to constrict around her throat, a chokehold of unspoken connections. A stillness settled between them, thick and heavy, until she finally whispered, "That's a lovely name." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension, an ache of recognition binding them both. Thomas felt the ghost of lost time creeping into his heart. Did Emily know more than she let on? He was consumed with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. Yet he couldn't bring himself to ask, fearing that probing might push her away, unraveling the fragile bond they'd formed in the shadow of sorrow. Their laughter faded into quiet contemplation as the moon rose higher, each moment steeped in unexpressed feelings. Days rolled into weeks, and Thomas's curiosity grew alongside an anxiety that twisted in his gut. He often caught Emily staring into the distance, her mind seemingly adrift in a sea of memories he couldn't grasp. One late afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Thomas approached her, his heart racing. "What do you remember?" he asked quietly, hoping his voice would cut through the haze that surrounded her. Emily's eyes flickered with confusion, a spark of fear igniting the tender expression on her face. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her fingers brushing the collar of her dress nervously. I don't know." Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant roll of thunder. The storm brewing outside mirrored the tumult within. each flash of lightning illuminating the weight of unsaid truths. Thomas longed to peel back the layers of Emily's past, to understand the girl who had appeared in his life like a fragile blossom pushing through concrete. But fear held him back, weaving a barrier he couldn't breach. "Sometimes it feels like—" She trailed off, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer, drawn to her vulnerability like a moth to a flame. "Like you know me," she confessed, eyes locking onto his, desperately searching for understanding. The confession hung in the air, electrifying and raw. Thomas felt the impact of her words crash over him like the storm. It was a revelation that disoriented him. "You say my daughter's name," he replied quietly, and the air around them crackled with tension. As raindrops began to fall, pattering softly against the earth, the weight of unresolved emotions crashed over them. Thomas reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining, a connection forged in shared grief and hidden truths. But Emily's eyes darted away, fear creeping back into her expression. It was as if she were teetering on the edge of a precipice, and he was helpless to pull her back. "I don't want to hurt you," she said finally, her voice cracking, leaving Thomas standing in the downpour, wrestling with the storms raging inside them both. The sun dipped low on the horizon, a reluctant farewell casting a warm golden hue over the cemetery's weathered stones. The shadows lengthened, and a silence so profound enveloped the graveyard where Thomas, the gravedigger, stood with Emily. The fresh earth still clung to her ashen skin, and she looked both ethereal and ghostly, a tragedy come to life. He had never seen a person so close to death yet so vividly present, a living contradiction that stirred something deep within him. Thomas turned away to wipe the dirt from his hands, each flick of his wrist releasing memories long buried. He had spent years filling graves, his heart hardened to the sorrows around him. But Emily was different. With her glassy eyes reflecting a haunting awareness, she had emerged from her wooden prison, a miracle in the midst of decay. He stole a glance at her, the way she flexed her fingers, absorbing the sensation of life creeping back into her bones, and felt a rush of protectiveness swell inside him. She was fragile, but there was an ember of strength igniting behind her gaze, a flicker that made him want to shield her from the darkness surrounding them. "What do you want to do now?" he asked, the words escaping before he could swallow them back. He didn't know why he had asked. Perhaps it was an attempt to grasp at normalcy when everything felt unsteady, or perhaps a desire to connect with a girl he didn't truly know. Emily shrugged, her shoulders dropping as if the weight of uncertainty pinched at her. The corners of her mouth turned downward, and for a moment he watched the flicker of sadness break through her frail facade, a candle flickering in a tempest. "Just anywhere but here," she whispered, her eyes scanning the tombstones, as if each one held secrets she wasn't ready to uncover. Thomas could see the fear and confusion etching lines across her brow, memories of a life stolen from her flashing in her expression. He felt the urge to cradle her thoughts in his hands, to wipe away the fractures of despair that marred her spirit. Instead, he nodded, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them, each heartbeat echoing the weight of unspoken words. They started walking, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet filling the void. Thomas took the lead, his mind racing with questions, but they were tangled in a web of emotions he couldn't untangle. He cast sideways glances at Emily, acutely aware of the fragility of their connection. Her presence felt like a spark in a dying ember, igniting something both beautiful and terrifying. His thoughts spiraled back to his daughter, the ghost of her laughter echoing in the recesses of his mind, a painful reminder of what he had lost. And yet, here was Emily, breathing life back into his memories. "Did you have anyone?" Emily's voice broke through his reverie, soft as a sigh caught between dreams. For a brief moment he hesitated, the shadows of the past intertwining with the present. He looked at her, her eyes searching for answers, for acceptance. It was in the way she leaned slightly closer, The way vulnerability poured from her like raindrops on a parched earth. He felt the weight of his sorrow crash against the walls he had built, and a part of him wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden he carried. A lump formed in his throat as he finally replied, "I had a daughter. Her name was also Emily." The confession hung in the air like a frozen breath. They both paused, the weight of the name heavy between them, knitting their fates together in an inexplicable bond. Emily's gaze flickered with understanding, then with something else, something deeper, as if she were searching the recesses of his grief for a path forward. He watched as realization dawned in her eyes, a fleeting moment of recognition that crossed a chasm they had both been afraid to cross. I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with an empathy that surprised him. It was a compassion that seemed to bridge the distance of their disparate worlds. There was no judgment in her gaze, only an unspoken connection that wrapped around them like an invisible thread. In that space, raw honesty flooded in, igniting memories he thought long buried. It felt as though the universe had conspired to bring them together, stitched by the threads of loss and rebirth. As they continued, side by side, the sunset bathed them in hues of orange and crimson, moments slipping into the fabric of their lives like whispered secrets. Thomas felt the weight of his daughter's absence shift, an ache that felt both heavy and light. For the first time in years, he allowed the grief to crack open, letting the light pour in. And in that fleeting moment, he realized that through Emily, perhaps he could find the strength to heal. The cold wind rustled through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fading memories. Emily shivered as she stepped closer to the weathered gravestones, their inscriptions barely visible beneath layers of moss. Thomas stood nearby, arms crossed tightly against his chest, though the chill he felt came from deeper within. They had spent days together in this mournful sanctuary, trapped in a world where silence spoke volumes and grief hung over them like an ominous cloud. Yet in the depths of that sorrow, something unspoken brewed, connecting them in ways neither dared to acknowledge. Emily knelt beside a small, crumbling headstone, her fingers tracing the engraved name that bore the tender imprints of a life snuffed out too soon. She could almost hear the echoes of laughter that had once danced around this place, soft and fleeting. Thomas watched her from a distance, his heart twisting painfully at the sight. It was more than just the fragility of her presence. It was the resemblance he recognized in her gestures, the way she hesitated, the reverence she carried for the dead, the quiet strength in her sorrow. Perhaps it was foolish to see shadows of past in someone who had just clawed her way back from darkness, but the connection was undeniable. "Do you remember her?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She broke the stillness, turning to face Thomas, her eyes searching his for understanding. The name lingered unspoken, hovering in the air like a specter. He felt the weight of the question, aware of the depth it implied, aware of the past that wove itself through the fabric of their lives. He opened his mouth to respond, to share the echoes of his own sorrow, but all he could manage was a nod, a soft acknowledgement that perhaps they were both haunted by the same ghost. She returned her gaze to the headstone, the corners of her mouth gently tugging upwards as she recalled the girl whose name had been etched into his heart. "I can feel her," she murmured, almost to herself, like she's watching over us. The sentiment wrapped around Thomas, striking him with a warmth that was both unsettling and familiar. His breath caught in his throat as he realized Emily might truly understand the love and loss that threaded through life, binding souls together even beyond the grave. In that moment, it happened. Something shifted between them, a heartbeat shared in the space of what remained unspoken. Thomas stepped closer, letting the distance between them shrink, and he could see a glimmer of understanding reflected in her eyes. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against hers as they both touched the gravestone, creating a delicate bridge that seemed to transcend the weight of tragedy. Time slowed, and for a heartbeat, they were not just a gravedigger, and a girl found alive in a coffin. They were two souls intertwined by loss, by a past that echoed through their very bones. Emily turned her hand to meet his, the warmth of their touch igniting a spark that danced between them. A vulnerability bloomed in her chest, a silent plea that spoke volumes. Here I am, and I am more than the shadows that haunt me. It was a gesture of connection, a silent promise that neither would face the darkness alone. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat, a sudden rush of emotions that threatened to spill forth. In that brief moment, he saw the girl he had lost reflected in the woman before him, a mirrored grief that resonated deeply. They stood together, the world around them fading into background noise. The autumn leaves swirled like confetti in the breeze, and the cemetery transformed into a sanctuary filled with whispers of the past and promises of tomorrow. Emily exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the chilly air, and Thomas could see the strength building within her as she acknowledged the pain that connected them both. He squeezed her hand gently, a promise that he would stand by her side, a reminder that she was not alone in this world of shadows. "You're not just a ghost to me," he finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You're alive, and that means something." The words hung heavy in the air, a powerful truth that resonated between them. Emily looked up, her gaze locking onto his, and in that moment, something monumental shifted. Maybe they could carve out new paths from the remnants of their shared grief. Maybe, just maybe, hope could bloom amidst the graves, bringing them closer than they had ever dared dream. As they lingered in the embrace of that moment, a new chapter began to unfold, one woven from sorrow, yet tinted with the first hints of light. Emily felt the weight of the world lift slightly, while Thomas found a flicker of warmth that had lain dormant for far too long. In the heart of the graveyard, amidst the echoes of the past, two souls began to turn toward the future, united by the names etched into the soil, forever intertwined in the story that was just beginning. Emily sat on the edge of the rickety wooden chair, her fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of her sleeve as she stared into the dim light of the room. The air felt thick, each breath a reluctant push against the weight that pressed on her chest. Thomas had been quiet for days, their shared silence a chasm that neither seemed willing to cross. The warmth of his presence, once a comforting blanket, now felt like a distant ember, sparking memories of laughter that echoed hollowly in her mind. She had survived a coffin, yet here, surrounded by warmth and life, she felt buried deeper than ever. She glanced at Thomas, who leaned against the weathered wall, arms folded, his eyes fixed on the floor. There was a worry etched in the furrow of his brow, a deep-rooted concern that he was failing her. But Emily knew the struggle was hers alone. The haunting whispers of the past wrapped tightly around her, suffocating the light inside. The moment he had pulled her from the grave, she had become a ghost herself, trapped between the world of the living and the shadows of her memories. The name that haunted her dreams kept bubbling to the surface, but each time she reached for it, the echoes grew louder, drowning her in guilt and despair. "Emily." Thomas broke the silence, the sound of her name cutting through her thoughts like a blade. "We need to talk about what happened." His voice wavered, a mixture of apprehension and determination. He stepped closer, the air between them shifting, thickening with unspoken truths. She could see the flicker of hope in his eyes, the longing to understand her, but all she felt was the creeping dread that she didn't truly belong in this world anymore. As he held her gaze, Emily felt the walls she had built start to tremble. She wanted to reach out, tell him everything, the fear, the confusion, the pain, but the words felt locked away in a dark cellar of her mind. How could she explain the name that constantly slipped through her fingers like grains of sand? The name that shattered the remnants of her sanity, reopening wounds she thought had begun to heal. Each time she thought of it, a weight pressed harder against her chest. She swallowed the lump in her throat, searching for strength but finding only darkness. Thomas took another step closer, his presence simultaneously grounding and daunting. "I know it's hard. You don't have to..." He paused, his brows knitting together as if he could sense the cyclone of emotions swirling within her. "You don't have to go through this alone. I'm here." The sincerity in his voice was like a draught of fresh air, yet it only intensified the storm raging inside her. She wanted to scream, to push him away, to reclaim her solitude. But she also craved the connection he offered. "Thomas, I can't." Her voice came out barely above a whisper, and she hated the way it cracked, exposing the fragility of her resolve. She turned away, her back to him, as if that could shield her from the truth pressing against her skin. "I'm not who you think I am. I was in that coffin, lost to the world. And now I don't even know how to be who I was. You don't understand." "I'm trying to understand," he implored, each syllable a desperate plea. "But you have to let me in. You have to trust me." Adi. The softness in his tone was like a double-edged sword, slicing through the heavy fog, but also cutting deeper into her heart. She clenched her fists, battling the turmoil inside her as she felt the floodgates beginning to tremble. What if she opened up? What if the name slipped out and everything she feared came crashing down? "Thomas!" Her voice erupted, raw and filled with anguish. She turned, meeting his gaze with a fierce intensity that made the air hum. "What if I tell you? What if I say it out loud? It won't change anything. It will only bring more pain." She paced away, her thoughts spiraling. The girl in the coffin. She was supposed to be dead. And now I'm here pretending to live, but every moment feels like a betrayal. His silence enveloped her, the weight of his understanding pressing down upon her. Then he spoke, his voice steady. "Tell me. Name her. Let the world know she existed. Let's honor her, Emily." It was as if a dam had broken within her. She felt the rush of memories, flashes of laughter and joy, of warmth and love, tattooed into her soul. She took a breath, the name rolling off her tongue painfully, yet with an undeniable urgency, an invocation from the depths of her heart. "Lila," she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks, the sound erupting from her as if it had been trapped in a cage for too long. Her name was Lila, and in that moment, with the weight of the name finally released, the atmosphere shifted. She felt the grip of despair loosen just enough for a sliver of light to pierce through, illuminating the dark corners of her heart. For the first time, she didn't just feel like a girl found alive in a coffin. She felt like a daughter mourning an unfulfilled promise, allowing herself the full spectrum of grief that came with it. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Thomas felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, mingling with the memory of Emily's fragile presence. She was no mere phantom in his life. She was a living testament to the impossible. But tonight they stood at a precipice, the past and the future colliding with a force that left Thomas breathless. He had accepted her into his life, with the naivete of a man desperate for resurrection. Little did he know, their fate was intricately woven with memories he had tried to bury. Every moment spent in the company of Emily further unraveled the fabric of his grief. Her laughter, a melodious echo of his lost daughter, reverberated within the walls of his lonely heart. How could he entertain such joy when the very essence of his happiness had been ripped away? Yet Emily had slipped through his defenses, her vulnerability revealing a flicker of hope he had long extinguished. But hope, he realized, was often a double-edged sword. Every joyous laugh held the potential for deep sorrow, and every shared glance bore the weight of impending loss. In the dim light of the shack that had become their refuge, Thomas watched Emily meticulously arrange the flowers before the small altar he'd created. Each bloom was a vibrant reminder of life's tenacity. With every moment, the girl he had once rescued began to feel like more than just a second chance. She felt like a piece of him. But as he observed her, he couldn't shake the feeling that beneath her bright exterior lay uncharted depths of pain. He sensed something lurking just beneath the surface, a shadow that threatened to engulf their burgeoning connection. "Tommy," she said softly, breaking the silence that enveloped them. The name she had fashioned for him. It dripped with a warmth that made the chill in the air retreat slightly. He turned to face her, his heart caught between the remnants of old wounds and the promise of new beginnings. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life, as if you've been dropped into a dream that isn't quite yours? The question hung heavily between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the chasm they both inhabited. He swallowed hard, the raw truth of her words striking him to the core. Sometimes, he whispered, the admission tasting bitter against his tongue. Sometimes, it feels like my life ended the moment I lost her. The gust of wind outside seemed to echo his grief, rattling the wooden frame of the shack. Emily's expression shifted. The light in her eyes dimmed momentarily, and Thomas could see the cracks in her facade, the vulnerability she so desperately tried to conceal. "Tommy, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. The tone sent a wave of apprehension coursing through him. He stepped closer to her, bracing for her revelation. "I've been having dreams about the coffin." The words tumbled out, and with each passing moment Thomas's heart raced. It felt as though time had paused, the air thick with unspoken fears and long-held secrets. "In those dreams, there's a name that lingers on my lips, a name that I think I might know." His breath hitched, dread coiling in his gut. "Emily," he urged, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What name?" She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting both clarity and chaos. It's Sarah." The name ricocheted around the small room, heavy and haunting, igniting memories he thought had been safely buried. His breath stopped entirely, the name invoking a flood of anguish he had not anticipated. In that instant, everything shifted. The time-worn scars that shielded him from the world cracked open anew. "Sarah." The words slipped from his lips, trembling in the air, as memories of his daughter washed over him like a violent tide. In that moment, he saw Emily in a different light, not merely a girl who had been buried alive, but a part of his own lost story. A reflection of the past he thought he could never confront. The realization was a devastating jolt, a reverberation of loss and longing that coursed through him. You called out to her," he stammered, the revelation sinking like lead in his chest. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, her vulnerability laid bare before him. "I didn't know," she confessed, the weight of the truth settling like a shroud. "But I felt her presence guiding me, urging me to find you." The room spun around them, the boundaries of reality blurring, the figures of a father and daughter lost in the shadows of grief, suddenly reunited in an unexpected spiral of fate. In that powerful moment, the desolation began to lift, allowing a bittersweet light to creep through the cracks, illuminating the possibility of connection, of hope, and of healing in this unlikeliest of bonds. The sun dipped low, casting a warm golden hue over the earth as Emily knelt by the grave, fingers tracing the engraved name. Thomas stood beside her, the weight of an unsaid farewell settling between them. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees, rustling leaves like hushed confessions. Emily placed a wildflower at the headstone, its petals trembling as if shyly embracing the moment. Thomas watched, his heart heavy yet strangely lightened by her presence. She looked up, eyes brimming with a mix of sorrow and understanding, a reflection of his own turmoil. He reached out, brushing a fallen leaf from her hair, a delicate gesture that spoke of care and connection. In that quiet exchange, a bond formed, fragile yet unbreakable, woven through shared grief and the haunting spectre of the past. As the last rays of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon, they stood side by side, the silence thick yet soothing. Somewhere in the distance a bird sang, its melody wrapping around them like a promise. With a slow breath, they turned away from the grave, hand in hand, embarking on a new path born from loss, their hearts forever intertwined.